Terrence, I loved your book. I
Thank
thought
you.
it was so interesting. I devoured it. And I had no idea about this plot to assassinate Kennedy in Chicago.
Right.
How did you find out about this? How did you come up with the idea?
Well, from your background, you know how people go down rabbit holes of different
Yes.
ideas and things like that. So for me, and I've said this elsewhere, I've always loved those conspiracy theories, even though I don't believe 99% of them. I believe UFOs are probably drones. I don't think they're little aliens. I don't believe in ancient aliens. I think people got along a lot more than we thought they did back in prehistoric times. It just makes more sense than somebody showing up and then disappearing without leaving a trace. And Bigfoot, bears stand on their hind legs more than people thought now that they're studying them more. I think a lot of those sightings are that. But with the JFK stuff, whenever I would start doing a little bit of digging on it, because there was always something just that didn't quite fit. And it wasn't like you see details in a lot of these true crime documentaries where or true crime stories where you say, okay, yeah, life is like that. It's not always neat. But there were so many things that just didn't fit, and I just always would collect all of these different theories about the JFK case. And then throughout that reading, I heard about the gentleman's real name is Abraham Bolden, and
Yeah.
how he got in trouble in '64 by going to the Warren Commission about this plot he uncovered in
Yeah.
Chicago. And then now, over the last few years, people have really dug into that part and all of the secondary, tertiary ideas that are linked to the Kennedy assassination. And that's where more and more people have started to learn about the Chicago plot and how deep it went. And it wasn't just one guy who was talking about doing something to the president. There were a lot of other people who were involved, like Homer Echeverria, who I mentioned
Yeah, yeah.
in the book, and so that's why I encourage people: don't take my word for it. Google it, and you'll see all of this stuff come up in
Yeah.
reputable sources.
Well, I read your afterword, which was super interesting too. And I want to ask you about Arthur Golden, but my question about so it is based on a true plot. How much did you fictionalize and how did you decide what to fictionalize?
Sure. I mean, Abraham Bolden, or is different in the book in that he only went to the Warren Commission in 1964 with the notion of what this plot was based on what he heard on the radio. There were actually not a lot of Secret Service agents who were doing the Cuban surveillance and also that were surveilling Thomas Valley. There were only about two of them, and they played a smaller role. And in later years, they said, well, we don't really know what it was, but they were very guarded, and justifiably so, in what they would say, because if there was a Chicago plot, then there definitely was a
Yeah.
Dallas plot. And there's also been links to the Miami plot as well that didn't take place, but there was one. People bragged about it. So what I did was say in this novella, take two of the Secret Service agents, combine them into one person who was the
Okay.
hero of the story anyway,
Yeah.
because he had a great story. In
Yeah.
my book, it's Abraham Golden, but he had a fantastic story, and he was the first African American to protect
Yeah.
President Kennedy, and he did an awful lot for the country, and I think he was a hero in trying to get at least word of the plot out there. He didn't solve it, but he definitely said, look,
Yeah.
something went on, take a look at this. And then they set him up in later life, and he went to jail for accepting a bribe for many
Yeah.
years.
Yeah, I read about that in your afterword, and that was kind of shocking to me. And the guy is so interesting, and I think nobody knows about him. And I think it's so
Right.
cool that you brought him to life. Um, and you mentioned that Biden had, I mean, I don't know, I don't want to spoil anything, but you mentioned Biden had pardoned him recently.
Yeah, in 2022. Yes, it
And
was amazing.
yeah, I mean, and did you know that when you were writing it? I mean, had that already happened, or you wrote before the pardon?
Right. Well, it's funny. I started writing this one because I was writing. I'm currently writing a trilogy called Dallas '63, where I talk about the assassination of Kennedy from a Dallas street detective's point of view. So he's a Dallas PD detective assigned to special investigations, and he uncovers a lot of what led up to the assassination. This plot was hatched in Chicago, but there are sources that say the Dallas PD and the FBI learned about it from Lee Harvey Oswald, who was a FBI informant at the time. And in my book, Dallas 63, he's also an informant. But it's documented that the word of the Chicago plot was uncovered by a guy named Lee, and it was from the Dallas area.
Interesting. Yeah, that was one of my questions, was what links, if any, were there between Chicago and Dallas? So that's interesting. So my question about the real life Arthur Golden, who you said is named Arthur Bolden in
Abraham Bolden is the real life Abraham.
You
Yeah,
said. That's right. Sorry.
Yeah, Abraham Bolden is the real life person. Abraham Golden is the person in my novella.
Right. I said Arthur for some reason.
That's right.
My question so he's still alive?
He is, yes. I believe he's in his mid to late 70s. He just released a book a few years ago. I believe it's called Echoes from Dealey Plaza. It's the right word is in my the right title is in my afterword, and it's a fascinating read. I went through it, and obviously anyone who's telling their own story is going to make themselves the George Washington of their own revolution. But there is no doubt that he did uncover something. He didn't say it was definitive. He just said this is something that just doesn't make sense, and I think you should investigate it. And the tragedy is, and this isn't covered in the novella, is that, as we just discussed, he ultimately paid a big price for it. Right.
Have you considered reaching out to him in real life and giving him your novella? Because I think it'd be interesting to hear his take.
Right. Yeah, I would definitely like to do that. I know he's got a book publisher. We were really concentrating on writing the novella first, and then developing the marketing plan, getting it produced, and everything like that up to this point. But now that it's gotten some good reviews, I think I'm ready to reach out to him and see if he likes it. Like I said, he didn't do a lot of the stuff that's in the book, but I think he might. I had to take a certain literary license, because I'm not writing a fact novel. I'm writing fiction, and I changed his name on purpose. Right. But there were also some other people that are, all of the police that I write about, they were actual police officers, but I changed their names a little bit. Yeah.
So that's also one of my questions, because your book really portrays the FBI and the police in kind of a negative light, I would say. And to what extent do you feel like it was incompetence versus corruption, and the relative weight of the two?
Right. I don't think it was FBI corruption. I think it was FBI wait and see. I think they investigated everything. I know they're taking a lot of heat nowadays, but you can't blame them for everything you accuse them for and say they're incompetent, because they're a very capable organization. And I personally admire the people who go to work every day and do that kind of work. I think it's a small minority of people, even in senior leadership, who are responsible for a lot of the problems that we've read about recently. I think back then it was the same thing. Hoover probably didn't understand what he had. It was worth noting, it was worth following, but he wasn't going to run around like his hair was on fire and say, oh, we have to do something about this. They were an investigative agency back then. They weren't necessarily a frontline response team like they are now. So in terms of the smoky room with a bunch of old guys with gray hair plotting the universe, I don't think that happened. I think that this was the first plot that they uncovered, and they figured this group couldn't pull it off, and they didn't pay much attention to them, and until everything happened in Dallas. But the Chicago police officers I mentioned, they had a history of problems even after this. This is why I didn't just go with this article. I didn't read just an article and say, oh, these guys are going to be my villains. No, there were a lot of other things that happened later on in their careers, especially one of the officers who executed a Black Panther in Chicago. That actually happened.
That's crazy. Yeah.
So, once you take everything in hindsight, it definitely helps it help me to say, you know what, this is a conceivable idea of what happened back then.
No, I thought it sounded totally plausible. And I wrote down one of your lines that really struck me that I loved. One of the characters says this, the plan, I think it was the motorcade plan for Kennedy. Um,
Hmm.
I mean, so crazy to think that they would have such a slow turn on that, on the exit. Um, but, but believable.
Right.
But this line was, it wasn't just drawn up on the back of a cocktail napkin after a few martinis. And I love that because having worked in the government, I feel like we've drawn up plenty of crap on cocktail napkins after a few martinis.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. And that's the other thing too. I spent 25 years in New York State government. So, you were in the federal government. I was in state
Yeah.
government, and economic and transportation. You were doing the important stuff. But people think, oh, there's the myth of the hyper prepared government,
Right?
and it's just not the case. I mean, sometimes
Exactly.
people just make mistakes. Sometimes sometimes there is nefarious stuff, but the mechanisms of government is such that you just can't. One person can't do everything, and
Oh, exactly. No,
that
I thought you did such a good job of that. I mean, and yeah, I mean, I remember when I worked for DoD as an intel analyst. It was when Bill Clinton was coming for a summit in Sarajevo, as I recall. He came to Sarajevo, and I was stationed in Sarajevo, and he was going to go through the streets, and our assignment was to come up with the threats, and we were like, what do we know? Like, it was literally like cocktail napkins. We were like, could someone fire an RPG from this window? He's going on this street. We don't know, But I
right.
love that part of it. So another thing I loved was the description of Chicago, some of your streets and
Hmm.
like the boarding house and the woman sweeping the leaves on the sidewalk, the cleaning lady. I mean, I really loved your imagery and your characters. And
Thank you.
and my question is, where did you go to Chicago, and how were you able to recreate that so vividly?
Well, I've born and raised in New York. It's always going to be my home. I love it, but I do love Chicago too, and we spent a lot of time. My wife and I spent a lot of time there on vacations and long holidays, things like that. And I fell in love with the place because it felt like what New York used to be. New York
Yeah.
lost a lot of its charm, not because of the densification of Times Square. Times Square was a dangerous pit and a hellhole, and it wasn't very
I,
pleasant.
I
People look
remember.
out yeah, I mean, people looked back at it now with nostalgia, but it was really a bad place.
Oh,
And
I remember. I totally remember that. Yeah.
yeah, it wasn't romantic and it wasn't fun. It was dangerous. And Chicago seemed to have that calm presence about them, where we understand it, we can handle it, and relax. We're on it. And I always loved the feeling that I got in the streets, even though a lot of the places had been rebuilt. So for this book, I took that knowledge that I had and that feeling I got from the overall modern city, and went back and did research on what the different areas of the city were like back in 1963. And they're completely different. There's been a lot of gentrification, a lot of different parts of
I
town.
bet.
Yeah,
So
and so it
like,
was fun going
how do
back and doing that.
how were you able to to find out what a street looked like in 1963?
It was a lot of Google searches and an awful
Uh-huh.
lot of reading of sources where people would describe a neighborhood, like a rundown neighborhood or one that used to be great and wasn't anymore.
Yeah.
I always try, one of the things that inspired me greatly was The High Window by Raymond Chandler, where
Uh-huh.
it's a lot of people don't talk about that book in particular, but he writes one, I think it's chapter 8. He opens it up with the detective on the street surveilling someone in a rundown part of town. And it awed me then, and it still awes me 20 years after I read it, because he just got that grittiness. So when I describe a city or I describe a block, I try to do that without imitating it too much.